Madam Chairperson, distinguished participants on the dais, esteemed colleagues, the participants of this national conference, and my dear students. It's a matter of great privilege to be here, and this is a kind of homecoming for me. This is the university where I was groomed. For about 3 decades, I am associated with this university, with the Department of Anthropology. And when my colleagues complained that you passed through us, but then you never looked at us because you were surrounded by people, I beg apology because they are all my students, and therefore it's very natural for a teacher to be mocked by his or her students. I'm indeed grateful to the organizers, the CIPS, the Government of Andhra Pradesh, the Department of Anthropology of the University of Hyderabad, and particularly Dr. B.V. Sharma for giving me this opportunity to talk something before you. Friends, at the inaugural session, as well as just now, the chairperson pointed out that there is a gap between evidence-based research and policy. There is absolutely no denying to this fact. Many of us are anthropologists. If not anthropologists, we are field workers, and we know that there is absolutely wide gap between evidence-based research and policy, whether it is tribal policy or some other policy, there is always a wide gap. My intention here is to address to these issues that what are these gaps and how to bridge this gap. I'll try to limit my presentation to the barest minimum, leaving the platform to my other administrator friends to throw light on this issue. Many of you know that I was on the both sides of the table as an academic for a very long time, and also as an administrator, directly or indirectly associated with policy planning for tribals as well as for others. So therefore, I consider that my own life is a kind of revealing story to talk about the difference between, or the gap between research, evidence-based research and policy. Let me start with 2 small anecdotes. As a very young research scholar in the early 80s, my supervisor asked me to go to Arunachal Pradesh for my doctoral work. Young students, let me remind you that those were the days when the supervisor's words were final. There was no compromise, there was no negotiation. Sir, I want to work in Hyderabad, give me some topic. Those days are gone. I was absolutely new to Arunachal Pradesh. Coming from a coastal place, Bhubaneswar, I went to a place where the temperature was sub-zero. That was the month of September. I started living in a cow shed for about 2-3 months, and I was looking badly for some place because the winter was approaching very fast. Luckily, I found a veterinary assistant surgeon who was also young, a bachelor. Luckily, he had some shelter. He had a government quarters to stay. I requested him, sir, can I stay with you? He said, yes, of course, please come. I'm alone, so you could give me company. We stayed together for some time. Some part of my fieldwork period, it was 2 years. We stayed for some time. And then one day he said, I'm going on tour. I said, what is the work that you are doing? So he said that now there is an instruction from the government that I have to go and then get some milch cattle to be distributed among the tribes of Arunachal Pradesh. It was a very interior place. The government had introduced the milch cattle scheme. Many of you, the old generation anthropologists or policy administrators might recall that that was the scheme at some point of time. The idea of the government was that overnight, the tribal people would be entrepreneurs, they can sell milk, become rich, and their, economic standing will go up. That was the idea. The poor veterinary assistant surgeon was given this responsibility. He went to the district headquarters, got about 20 pairs for distribution in the village. That was a tribal village. He distributed, and then after a month or so, again an order came to evaluate, assess the success of the project. That how many people have got benefit, how people are selling their milk, and have they become rich. Poor assistant surgeon again went around the village to find out what has happened to the milk cattle, and he found, people reported that about 90% of the cattle have been eaten away by the tiger. The poor fellow came and then he reported to the boss that, sir, this is the thing. The reality, the fact of the matter is that there was, in between, there was a festival. These people were beef eaters. They butchered everything, eaten up, and then they said that tiger has eaten away. This is the kind of gap between, this is a wonderful example, I feel, between the gap between research and policy. Unless we know the culture of a community, no matter how good is the policy, it's not going to click. There was another small example. I was working in Andhra Pradesh. There is a tribe called Kondaredis, up on the hills, shifting cultivators. I was working with them. One day I went to their shifting field, Podu, and asked an old man, old farmer, that look, government is planning to have roads for you. Government is going to have school buildings for you. Government is going to have health centers for you. And he said very modestly, very politely, Babu, these things are useless for us. Then I asked him, what do you want? He said, can there be a scheme to fence my Podu so that wild boars don't enter into my Podu and destroy my crop? Can there be something to prevent the birds that destroy my crop? This is what the people want. Madam Chairperson said, need-based. This is the need-based kinds of policy that we should devise instead of imposing things on the people. This has been rampant all through since independence, and prior to that, of course, there was no tribal policy. But then, after independence, this has been a kind of top-down model of development. There have been schemes imposed on the people, and therefore, the result was not very encouraging. These things again crop up again and again in my mind, I always realize that how wide is the gap between evidence-based research and policy planning in this country. It's not in this country, as I will show you in other parts of the world also. It's not only in the developing country, also in the developed countries, this has become the problem. Next, please. Yes, there are critical gaps between evidence-based research and policy. Now, when I scan the literature, I find that there is absolutely no framework or approach available to bring evidence-based research into policy discussion. There is no framework. Just now, as I shared my experience, similarly, many of you can share your experience. But then there is nothing called a document that really to bring evidence-based research into policy discussion. Whether it is in India or outside India, there is nothing like that. Often variables such as values, politics, ideology, and customs have a significant influence in policy planning, but there doesn't appear to be a standardized and consistent way in which to bring them into the policy discussion. When we talk about policy, all these things have to come in. What are the requirements of the people? What we call the need-based policy. So therefore, there has to be some kind of values associated with policy making, but then there is absolutely no effort to bring all these things into the policy framework. This has become the problem. There is no way to assess the relative merits of this form of, I quote unquote, non-scientific evidence. Ideology is non-scientific. This is not based on very hardcore scientific research, but then it is a part of, it should be a part of the policy formulation, and therefore I find that there is no way that we can talk about the relative merit of these non-scientific evidences. Therefore, what I want to do in this brief presentation, I intend to submit some of the critical gaps between cultures of research. I say cultures of research. As a student of anthropology, I'm very fond of using the word culture. So I say cultures of research and general policy making, or the culture of policy making, or culture of the policy makers. And second thing, I would probably try to give some suggestions for reconciliation and meaningful collaboration between these two kinds of cultures. That is the culture of research and cultures of policy making. And Madam Chairperson, I think you addressed to this issue that how to bring about a kind of reconciliation, and that exactly I am going to do. Now, what are these critical gaps? As I told you, that this kind of critical gap is not peculiar for the developing countries. We might think that this is true for India. Not true. Even in the developed countries also, this is a problem, the problem of wide gap between evidence-based research and policy making. I have just two authors which I want to quote and draw your attention to the fact that in developing countries like United Kingdom or in Canada, this has become a perpetual problem. Some of you might be knowing Barbara Mary Stocking, those who have worked in Oxfam. She was for some time the highest executive director of the Oxfam, basically a pharmacologist by training. What she says? She says that there is no credible research. For what? For policy planning. It is a very straightforward kind of allegation. The research is not need-based. The research is never geared for policy making. So therefore, she says there is no credible research. Second, she says policy makers are not knowledgeable. I think this is a very harsh kind of statement, but probably this comes from her heart, that they are not knowledgeable in the sense they don't care for this evidence-based research. They say, what nonsense. And I have experienced it, another experience, very briefly I'll say. One of my classmates at Jawaharlal University, I will not name, but he is the current CIPS secretary of the government of Sikkim. And he says, what do you do, academics? Only you talk about jargons. Do you have any idea of policy? We do policy. Administrators do policy. The chief secretary of Sikkim. I'm quoting him. And he says, of course, in lighter vein, we were friends. I take liberty on him. He takes liberty on me. He says, no matter what you are doing is all nonsense. And similarly, I say, what you do is all foolishness. So therefore, this kind of debate continues. But this is a kind of impression that many of the academics might have noticed in their lifetime, administrators talking about this. Bloody, what do you know about research? What kind of research? How it is useful for us? But Barbara Stocking says that many of the policy makers are not knowledgeable. She says public policy doesn't act as a product champion of knowledge. It's not a product. It has to be a process. I mean, she wants to distinguish between a product and a process. Overnight, you can't think of anything, whether it is a milk cattle scheme or a goatery scheme or a fishery scheme or whatever scheme. Overnight, you can't expect a kind of success. Many of our friends from NGOs are here. They might have realized that policy should be a process, not a product. And finally, she says, change is more difficult than expected. Government says, or the spokesperson of the government always hold the view, we want to change the entire tribal world. We want to make them, rich by tomorrow or by 2020, something like that. That is very difficult. And she says that change is more difficult than expected. She is a field person. She was associated with Oxfam. And then she retired as a president of a very prestigious United Kingdom university. I'll go back to Canada. Jonathan Lones identifies the following misunderstandings in the Canadian context. This is to drive home the point. It's not only peculiar for India, it's all over the world, whether it is developing country or developed country. He says, both consider each other's activities as generating products instead of engaging in processes. How true is he? This is a process. Development is a process. Policy is a process. But then, normally what we expect is overnight there should be some change. And this is the problem or real gap between research and policy. Nothing is ready-made that could be picked up instantly, whether it is goatery, whether it is milk cattle, or any other scheme that you talk about. He says that non-recognition between a context-free rational decision that is research driven, and a sensible decision that is pragmatically driven, such as interests, ideology, values, or opinions. There is always a gap between these two. Wherever there is an ideology, wherever there is a value, research people will say, what is this? Should we go by the sentiment of the people, or should we make them, or there should be some kind of target for the people? So this is the problem. Third one, he says, Jonathan says, that policymakers are not sensitive to the incentives that drive academic researchers in terms of funding and award. Many of you are academics, and you know the kind of research that you do, whether they have, how much they have to do with the policy planning. Most of this research are dependent on funding. Who is giving funding? WHO. All right, write a project on health. Who is giving funding? IFAD. Write a project on agriculture, isn't it? So we are more interested in the funding, from where funding comes, rather than a kind of policy making intention or policy making objective. And finally, he says, researchers rarely take into account the different stakeholders for their research. The culture in the research community is generally one of academic rigor that is measured by the complexity and nuance of language as well as ideas. This is the difference. We are more interested as academics to write research papers in journals. We are more interested in writing books rather than looking for a kind of policy-oriented research that would benefit the people. And by chance, as the end product, some schemes are beneficial for the people. That is well and good. But the intention is not exactly like, bringing about some kind of policy documents or policy decisions. I shall now come to the reasons for critical gaps. That was one of the expectations of this conference. What are the reasons for critical gaps between research institutes like mine, University of Hyderabad, let us say, and the policy planning agencies? Policy planning agencies are represented by the bureaucrats, by the legislators, by the government at large, and organizations or institutions, those who are engaged in policy making. For example, UNDP, or UNICEF, or WHO, or that kind of organizations. So they are all represented by policy planning agency. I consider that there are three cultural factors. If I overuse the word culture, you may feel a little awkward. So that is the reason I have not used culture, but exactly these are the three cultural factors: institutional culture between these two, research institutes and policy planning agencies; communicative culture; and epistemological or knowledge generating culture. Now I have got to be, to make the things clear, I have put them in a tabular form so that things become easier and comprehensible. First, I shall be talking about the institutional culture. Very briefly, I am talking about what are the differences between institutions and planning agencies, their agendas relating to research-based, evidence-based research and policy planning. First of all, research institute, number one, research institutes have educational goals. All universities, all institutes for that matters, have got educational goals targeting mainly the research community. For whom we are writing research paper? We are writing research papers mostly for the academic community, not much for the policy makers. By chance, if a policy maker is benefited by that, it's well and good. But it is never intentionally done so until and unless there is a very specific agenda behind any kind of research endeavor. In case of policy planning institutes or agencies, they mainly focus on activities like funding, from where the funds will come. Fund flow is the most important thing, or the donors are the more important components of the policy planning. Networking, lobbying, capacity development, and knowledge sharing. Most of our NGOs, most of our government agencies which are working, for example, in government of Odisha, recently they are taking up a project for the development of the PVTGs. And then they are waiting for IFAD money. Once IFAD money flows, according to IFAD's guideline, the planning will take place, or the planning design will take place. So this is the kind of difference between institutional and policy planning agency. Second one, research institutes normally prefers a thorough analytical approach, maybe even taking a step back once in a while for restudying or for reconsidering, and then to ensure everything is comprehensively explored and academically valid. Probably that is the worst quality. Whenever I approach funding agencies for a project, they say, how long will you take? I said, 2 years. I said, come on, 2 years we cannot afford to give that much of time to you. Can you do it in 2 months? And now slowly we have got, many of you know this, there is nothing new in this. And many of us have, of course, now accepting the projects with 1.5 months or 2 months or 3 months. We want to wind up in whatever way, rapid rural appraisal or whatever. So we do something, submit a report, and the matter is gone. But then normally, if you are a hardcore academic, you always prefer to have a thorough analytical approach to the problem so that you come out with a very concrete kind of conclusion. In the policy planning agency, they tend to move relatively fast and pragmatically. They say pragmatically. They say, what is the use of a research if you give a report after 2 years? We want to implement immediately. Otherwise, money will go back to Oxfam or money will go back to DFID. So we want to implement immediately. Give us something so that we will do. They tend to move relatively fast and pragmatically in response to the continuing and urgent demands of the stakeholders. Sometimes it is the stakeholder, sometimes it is the funding agency. This is a vital gap between the academic and the policy planning bodies. Number 3, a measure of success is a flourishing research community. For whom we are doing? We are doing for the research community, whereby critical analysis of practice and development of formal knowledge are the most important means by which this is achieved. This is a kind of more formal for the academic audience, for the academic community. Whereas for the policy making agencies, a measure of success is a vast network of NGOs. How many are actually getting involved in the process, achieving their institutional objectives, whereby its main output is financial and political support for civil organizations and initiatives that share its policy priorities. Here you see that how the research institutes, by nature, by default, they are different from the policy-making agencies. We'll move to the communicative culture. In the communicative culture, whom do we communicate and how do we communicate? We'll talk about the jargon, for example. In research institutes, when we write something, we publish in academic journals to gain academic credit, and it makes it less attractive for them to spend their time and energy re-articulating their ideas for practitioners or for people. If my article is published in Nature, I'm more than happy. Probably I think that is the best reward I got in my life. No matter whether it is useful or useless, no matter how much money I have spent, crores or millions. But in the policy planning, we find that they consider people the ultimate beneficiaries of their efforts and make an effort to ensure outputs are produced which are relevant and appropriate for the stakeholders. Of course, they have to do it. That is their mandate. That is their priority. If we come to the second point of communicative culture, knowledge for a research institute is acceptable after comprehensive analysis, thorough documentation, cross-examination, and peer review has proven it valid. This is beyond doubt that unless an article is peer reviewed, we don't consider it as a standard kind of article or a research paper. What happens in case of planning agencies? They rely primarily on empirical evidence, field-based evidence, to show whether policy and strategic assumptions are correct or not, often tested by sharing among the peers. At best, they call for a meeting of the concerned agencies, sit together, discuss, and then they finalize. The third point of communicative culture is academic knowledge is often proprietary because of the credit to be gained by the researcher and is only acceptable after publication in an academic journal. This is our ultimate objective, where it is getting published, whether a peer-reviewed standard A journal, anthropologist, whether it is American anthropologist or current anthropology, that is our objective, and is only acceptable after publication in an academic journal. Anything beside that is considered what we call a gray literature. We don't take it very seriously. And then normally we joke that where have you published it? In this overnight publications like these days we find after the UGC, changing UGC guidelines, there is a mushrooming growth of online journals. So we say these are the gray literature and doesn't really count. But for a research agency, planning agency, knowledge amongst development practitioners can be shared fairly openly and informally through a vast array of methods and tools, including storytelling, informal publications, and the internet. The basic idea is to communicate how people get to know, how people get aware, whereas an academics doesn't really think about this. We'll come to the third, that is the epistemological culture between research institutes and the planning agencies. Research institutes normally indulge in the pursuit of knowledge as objectively as possible. As objectively as possible. It may not be absolutely objective because nothing is absolutely objective. So therefore, as objectively as possible. Habermas, for example, captures this problem by identifying the subjectivity which idealism brings to scientific pursuit. I will not discuss further theory of Habermas theory, but then this is how we have all accepted that we try to become as objective as possible, but we know that we can't be 100% objective for various reasons. What happens in case of a planning agency? The practice-oriented pursuit of knowledge is an understanding and justification of human interest, a verification of methodological approaches, or rather simply understanding what works for whom. Whether it is a community, whether it is a group of people, what works for them is more important than a rigorous scientific kind of knowledge making, knowledge sharing. Second, it is precisely the intention of science to remove this very ideology, releasing knowledge from interest as far as practicable. We try to do as far as practicable. It may not be 100% correct or 100% successful. Whereas for a planning agency, it is precisely the pursuit of ideological interest that drives development practice. Who has to be benefited? Why has to be benefited? What is the development index? And how to make a kind of judgment regarding who needs more attention than others. The third epistemological cultural difference is effectiveness of knowledge depends on rigorous application of methods in case of academics, transcending time and space. We say there should not be any barrier of time and space as much as practicable. Whereas for policy planning agency, effectiveness of knowledge depends on whether it in fact addresses a human interest or ideology and whether the methodology it describes is appropriate for scientific purposes. This is the difference between epistemological culture between the research institute and a planning agency. After having discussed about these problems, how to bridge the gap, as all of us admit that there are gaps, but is there a possibility? I'm very optimistic that yes, there are possibilities. And these possibilities are the following, but just a classroom lecture will not help. It needs a kind of practical approach of facing each other, sitting across the table, discussing the issues and sorting out the problems. There are a series of suggestions, but then I have restricted to 12. There could be many of you could add a little more to that also. First of all, getting to know each other. And my fundamental question is, do we know each other? We do not. We know each other whenever there is a need. If I want a funding, I'll go to the special commissioner. I'll say, madam, give me some money. Otherwise, you are in your office chamber, I am at my university. We don't know each other. And therefore, the first thing should be, we should know each other institutionally, communicatively, and epistemologically, whatever I have described. How should we know each other? Sit across the table, and then only we know. Unless this culture is developed, our administrators are too busy. They don't have time to come to visit our academic institutes. Our academics have got too much of ego that why should I go to an administrator? So this kind of barrier has to come to an end as soon as possible to develop a kind of, understanding between us. Second, be patient and give up ego. Patience is a very important thing. As I said, nothing is achieved overnight. Don't be so ambitious, particularly about social planning, welfare planning, whether it is tribals or for others. See, we need to give enough time for that. So therefore, patience is very important. Third thing is a basic courtesy. Be respectful to each other. We try to become respectful because we meet very rarely. And of course, there is no room to quarrel when we meet once in a year or so. But then, the moment we start meeting frequently, there is a possibility of quarreling. Therefore, let us be respectful to each other as a matter of principle, as a matter of policy. Number 4, embrace diversity of knowledge production and dissemination. There is no single way of production of knowledge. Whether you are knowledgeable or I am knowledgeable, there is no single way. There are multiple ways. Let us listen to each other. A field person knows better. I always say my NGO partners that as far as field matters are concerned, you are more knowledgeable than me. As far as theory is concerned, maybe I might be knowing a little more than you. So therefore, this needs a kind of diversity of knowledge acceptance and production of dissemination of knowledge. Scientific knowledge is a non-starter without field knowledge. Many of us have the ego not to accept this. But I must say with emphasis that our knowledge is a non-starter without field knowledge. Unless we know, we talk about culture, unless we get ourselves involved with the people, we know the culture in its totality. You know that every anthropologist know that every small village has a culture of its own. But then we talk about when our students write a PhD thesis, they say this is, for example, culture change among the Kunda Reddys. And how many villages they have visited? Just one. And that is how they generalize that this is the kind of scope of the work, and that should be stopped. Scientific knowledge is a non-starter without field knowledge. Foster a clear and mutually beneficial frame of reference. How do we benefit each other? How academics gets the benefit from administrators and how administrators get the benefit from the academics, that has to be chalked out. Build the partnership incrementally, not overnight. It should be through a process, but unfortunately our bureaucracy, many of our bureaucrat friends are here, our bureaucracy is such a state that I always tell in lighter vein to my friends, to my bureaucrats friends, that today you are here in the Department of Panchayat Raj, and tomorrow when I visit the Secretariat, you are transferred to rural development. So therefore, what kind of incremental relation that we can have, unless there is some kind of permanence or a relative permanence, if not permanence. The government policy really doesn't, consider this as a kind of development, as a kind of, giving benefit to the people. This should be done. Long-term institutional collaboration is also required, that we should collaborate on a long-term basis, not for a project-to-project basis or not to a work-to-work basis. I also say that equal commitment to partnership has to be there, otherwise, we will fail. Academics will fail as well as policy planners will also fail. Tolerate each other's mistakes. This is a kind of magnanimity. We don't tolerate, we always highlight others' mistakes. That should stop. Rather, we should pull others from the mistakes that they commit so that there would be a kind of solution to the problems. Involve researchers, students, practitioners, and people in the strategic planning. This is normally not done. It is only a handful of people, those who talk about policy, and that is the reason why when I talked about Arunachal example, why milk cattle scheme was not popular. There is another story to this also. When I come back to my home state Odisha, I asked the tribal people there. Normally, my students might remember, when we go for a long field work, madam, we go for long field work with our students for their master's dissertation program. This is about 25-30 days sometimes. We make it a point always to carry milk powder with us, because in the tribal areas we don't get milk. All of you know this. Why? When I asked my tribal friend, why don't you sell milk? They say, we will be doing sin. I say, what kind of sin? They say milk is the right of the calf, and we can't really deprive a calf from its right of getting its mother's milk. Is it not a sin? We are dumbfounded. So therefore, we carry milk powder for our tea and coffee during the field work. Discuss and disseminate results publicly and widely. I don't know why academics are very shy. They want to distribute their work or disseminate their work only among the academics, not among the planners. My final words, as I said, it would be as brief as possible, giving room for others. We live in a knowledge society. All of us know, I don't have to tell this, but then we live in a knowledge society that demands knowledge sharing between research institutes and planning agencies. So far, unfortunately, we are compartmentalized. There is not much of flow of knowledge between these two agencies. But knowledge transfer between the two is limited. If at all there is some, it is very limited. Collaboration is limited. Sometimes it is negligible. And therefore, this is called the knowledge gap. Because of the knowledge gap, our planning strategy is not successful in most of the times. A partnership between planning agencies and development-oriented research institutes seems to be an obvious solution. Unless we sit together, unless we discuss issues across table, this cannot be sorted out. Experience shows that fundamental differences contribute to the apparent gap. The pragmatic approach harnessed by most planning agencies versus the thorough manner by which research institutes seek to move scientific knowledge. So therefore, this barrier has to be broken as far as practicable so that we can evolve planning strategies for development of the people. And finally, last but not the least, a progressive collaborative effort seems essential at this juncture. I said progressive. Progressive is giving up all our egos and then to make it little progressive so that we share with each other the knowledge, each other's knowledge, and that would be utilized for the welfare of the people, whether it is planning for the tribal people or for others. Thank you.